When thinking about ancient Egypt, many things come to mind, like pyramids, mummies, hieroglyphics, the Nile River, and ornate cat statues, to name a few. But there's so much more to this often fantastical and unique time in history. Here are some of the most unusual things the ancient Egyptians did. Number 1. Training baboons to catch criminals. You may have heard about how ancient Egyptians cherished cats, but did you know that they also made particular use of baboons? They were like the OG police animals. Step aside canine units. Apparently, Egyptian authorities walked around with baboons on leashes and released them on criminals. Classic hieroglyphics and artwork, including a piece called Old Kingdom from the 5th dynasty, circa 2498 to 2345 BCE, shows baboons apprehending thieves or other criminals by biting or holding them by the leg. In addition to helping the police, these animals were also trained to participate in picking fruit, making beer, and dancing. They were so revered in Egyptian culture that some mummies were later found with tattoos of baboons on their bodies. Number 2. Sacrificing and mummifying crocodiles. While archaeologists were discovering the mummified remains of humans, they also found the bodies of crocodiles that were preserved, but not always in the same way as humans. For instance, in 2019, while excavating the undisturbed tomb at Kabat al-Hawa, a necropolis on the western bank of the Nile River, 10 reptiles were found to be mummified without resin and evisceration of the remains, which are two main components of the mummifying process as a whole. But discovering fragments of mummified crocodiles, not 10 well-preserved specimens, is not uncommon for researchers, and it is believed that ancient humans preserved the animals as sacred offerings, kind of like food for the afterlife or for the reincarnations of the specific deities. Crocodiles specifically were associated with Sobek, the creator of the Nile and a powerful fertility god. Number 3. Using ox hooves, ashes, burnt eggshells, and a pumice for oral hygiene. The ancient Egyptians did not play around when it came to having fresh breath. They used a pumice in order to beat ox hooves, ashes, and burnt eggshells into a powder. Then, that powder was applied to the teeth and gums to protect their mouths from hygiene issues, and it was said to be pretty effective for those purposes, at least when it came to the cleaning aspect. In terms of overall health, it probably wasn't great seeing as it actively made gums bleed. Throughout time, they also used a combination of pepper, iris flowers, and rock salts. Interestingly enough, it's also thought that they were some of the first people to invent toothbrushes, or chew sticks as they were called back then. They crafted these instruments out of twigs, with one side serving as a toothpick and the other being frayed at the end to work like bristles. Members of that civilization also developed their own type of breath mints from concoctions of boiled herbs and spices, like frankincense or cinnamon, mixed with honey to be chewed or sucked on. Number 4. Shaving off their eyebrows when their cats died. You knew cats were going to come back around during this video. We weren't kidding when we said how much ancient Egyptians loved their feline friends. They believed that cats brought good luck to the people who owned them, and they treated them like royalty. In fact, they loved their cats so much that when a beloved cat died, all of the members of the family would shave their eyebrows off to mourn its death, and they would continue to grieve until their eyebrows grew back. Number 5. Bathing in sour milk. Ancient Egyptians, and most notably Cleopatra, were known to bathe in sour milk, typically donkey milk, to improve the look and texture of their skin. And it makes sense why that would work, because today, we know that sour milk contains lactic acid, which is a naturally occurring A-hydroxy acid. These acids peel away the surface of your skin, so that new, more evenly pigmented skin cells can generate and take their place. In Cleopatra's case, it has been said that 7,000 donkeys were needed at any given time to provide enough milk for her daily baths. Hey, at least she didn't necessarily let it go to waste. Number 6. Using moldy bread to heal wounds. As evidenced already, ancient Egyptians were intelligent and resourceful, but their treatment of wounds through the application of moldy bread may seem a little strange. However, this method was actually effective and was a precursor for the penicillin and other antibiotics used today. It worked because the mold on the bread was usually a fungus that would produce certain chemicals to kill or inhibit the growth of bacteria around a cut, scrape, or any other exposed wound. Number 7. One female pharaoh wore a fake beard. Hatshepsut was an Egyptian pharaoh in the 18th dynasty. The only problem was that she was a woman, and female pharaohs, of which there were 3 in total, were not always as respected as their male counterparts. Although in general, ancient Egypt was known for accepting gender equality for the most part. Why that didn't also apply to their rulers? Who knows? Anyway, she decided to take matters into her own hands, and she wore a long, ancient Egyptian-style beard in order to look more masculine. Some art depicting her often includes this fake facial hair. Number 8. Tied bags of mouse bones around the necks of infants and young children. It seems like there was a strong belief around the bones of rodents being able to heal children of their ailments. For example, in order to cure an ill infant, it is said that his or her mother would eat a mouse, and then the bones of that mouse would be put into a little canvas bag tied with 7 knots and then hung around the baby's neck as a talisman. It has also been speculated that members of the lower class would use a similar method to treat a child who was having problems with bedwetting. Number 9. Using canopic jars to store vital organs. Canopic jars were vessels used to store and preserve a deceased person's internal organs during mummification, and then buried with him or her. Each one held a different organ, one for the lungs, one for the liver, one for the intestines, and one for the stomach. As for the heart, that was thought to be the home of a person's soul, and that remained in the body. These jars were originally plain and unadorned, but as time went on, they started becoming more ornate and represented the 4 deities known as the sons of Horus. Hapi had the head of a baboon and stored the lungs. Duamatef the head of a jackal and held the stomach. Imseti had a human head and stored the stomach. And Kabesinuf had the head of a falcon and held the intestines. Number 10. One pharaoh is rumored to have ruled for 90 years. If the legend is true, King Pepi II holds the record of ruling ancient Egypt for the longest period of time, for 9 whole decades. He ascended to the throne when he was just 6 and lived to be in his mid to late 90s. He ruled Egypt during the 6th dynasty. However, a variety of modern Egyptologists contest this fact and instead believe that Pepi II actually ruled closer to 64 years. If that's the case, Pepi II would be the second longest reigning pharaoh, behind Ramesses the Great, who ruled for over 66 years during the 19th dynasty. Number 11. Had a highly developed tattoo culture. Although this is not necessarily unusual, the ancient Egyptians' tattoo culture is often overlooked. Not only were tattooed mummies dating back to the 11th dynasty found by archaeologists, but living women were depicted in Egyptian art to have tattoos in the form of dots and swirls on the lower chest, abdomen, and thighs. Due to those placements, many historians believe that the markings had something to do with asking the gods for protection and blessing during pregnancy. It was believed that only women of high status would get tattooed. As time went on, the tattoos became more detailed and often resembled a deity in order to pay tribute to and gain favor with that particular god or goddess. The tattooing process itself was also full of significance. It was seen as ritualistic and began with the creation of a flat tattooing brush. It was made of an odd number of needles and braided together in a bundle. They were typically made of 3, 7, or 9 needles, and the Egyptians placed importance on each of those numbers. After the tattooing brush was constructed, it would be dipped in charcoal, soot, or indigo powder, and then used to puncture the skin multiple times. Both soot and indigo contain antiseptic qualities, which help to prevent infection. Once a tattoo was completed, it was rubbed with various herbs and oils to promote healing and seal the coloring agents. Number 12. They used bread and beer as currency. As alluded to when we were talking about baboons making beer, the ancient Egyptians seemed to really dig beer, and they used it and bread as a form of currency between businesses. They were also thought to be central in offerings made to gods and dead ancestors. In fact, it is thought that the soldiers and the estimated 10,000 workers who built the pyramids were paid in beer and bread. The Egyptians loved them so much that they believed that it was a sign that the gods were unhappy with them when the Nile flooded, or when too many crops failed to flourish in order to produce enough beer and bread for the masses. Number 13. Built toilets into tombs. Out of reverence for the dead, ancient Egyptians built toilets into the tombs of the departed. This is because they believed that the deceased were still living, but were on the other side, which meant that basic necessities like food, water, bathrooms, etc. were still required. Number 14. Always covered the hair of the pharaoh. The hair of a pharaoh was considered sacred and was never to be seen. He or she would always wear a crown or a headdress called nemes. These specific fashion statements also separated them from the common people, who were not allowed to wear headdresses or hats. Number 15. Wore sandals with the faces of their enemies. King Tut specifically wore sandals with his enemies painted on the sole, so that he'd be trampling on his foes whenever he walked. At least 80 pairs of shoes were found in his tomb, and on at least one pair, there was an African prisoner on the inner sole of one shoe and an Asiatic prisoner that was on the other. These individuals represent the enemies of King Tut's kingdom. This was likely a war for an artistic representation to manifest reality, which was a common practice in ancient Egypt. Number 16. Created hieroglyphics without vowels. Hieroglyphics, although made up of 2,000 characters, only contained consonants. Therefore, there were no vowels, so we will never truly know how the Egyptians pronounced their words in ancient times. However, some accounts say that an equivalent to the letter E was sometimes included. Further, hieroglyphics are believed to be one of the oldest writing systems in the history of humankind. Number 17. Thought scarab beetles to be sacred. The family of Scarabaeidae as currently defined consists of over 30,000 species of beetles worldwide. They're often called scarabs or scarab beetles. Ancient Egyptians believed that the scarab had powerful regenerative powers. They understood that the sun died each night and was reborn in the morning as a beetle. As such, the scarab beetle stood for a symbol of birth, life, death, and resurrection. The symbol of these insects can be seen in art and jewelry. Scarabs are also associated with the gods Khepri, god of the morning sun, Atum, the sun god as creator, and Re, the god who personified the sun. Number 18. Made fly swatters from giraffe tails. This one is pretty straightforward. Ancient Egyptians commonly made fly swatters out of the tails of giraffes. Not only were these functional, but they were also thought to be extremely fashionable as well. And the function of these swatters makes sense because giraffes and many other animals use their tails when they're alive to keep insects away from their bodies. Number 19. Had unusual pets. We already mentioned that ancient Egyptians had a penchant for cats and baboons, but they also apparently kept other animals as pets, including hawks, ibises, a group of long-legged wading birds, lions, gazelles, and monkeys. Like cats, they also had domesticated dogs, which are common domesticated animals to this day. Although in ancient times, dogs were seen as more work dogs, used for hunting and guarding. But to be fair, modern people still use canines for those purposes too. Ancient dogs in Egypt were greyhounds, salukis, mastiffs, and dachshunds. Number 20. Pharaohs were buried with models of their servants. In the early days of ancient Egypt, the bodies of a pharaoh's servants were buried with their deceased leader. As time went on, however, a pharaoh would be buried with hundreds of miniature models of their servants instead. These figures were carved out of ushabti or shabti, and they were buried along with the pharaoh because they were designed to do the work that he or she didn't want to do in the afterlife. The figures also appeared to look mummified, which makes sense because they were also heading to the afterlife. Sometimes the models would be designed to represent distinctive purposes. For example, tiny soldiers, farmers, cooks, beer makers, fishermen, and boat handlers were discovered with applicable tools in their hands that were necessary for carrying out their specific jobs. There was a magical spell that was written inside each tomb to activate the magic figurines. Specifically, it was spell number 6 from the Book of the Dead. It went like this: O Shabti, if the deceased be summoned, to do any work which has to be done in the realm of the dead, to make arable fields, to irrigate the land, or to convey sand from east to west. Here I am, you shall say. I shall do it. Number 21. Believed that the tears of Isis flooded the Nile River. Ancient Egyptians believed that the Nile River flooded every year because of the tears the goddess Isis shed for her husband Osiris after he'd been slain. It was thought that she cried in mourning, but also in an attempt to knit his body back together. They celebrated the night of the teardrop by sailing the river in colorful boats, singing praises of their gods, and giving gifts to the river. This celebration is actually still celebrated, but it's more of a tribute to the past in the Egyptian culture as a whole. Number 22. May have used loincloths to protect themselves. Some historians believe that people, especially men, in ancient Egypt used loincloths as a method to prevent the spread of disease during intimate encounters. Hieroglyphics also show men wearing thin cloth to protect their lower parts from the sun and tropical diseases during battle, and in order to ward off evil spirits. It's also thought that they would dye the cloths in various colors to make them more attractive and appealing. This practice is also attributed to the worship of the god of reproduction and fertility. Number 23. Tended to reproduce with members of their own families. Cleopatra is a great example of this. It is believed that her parents were brother and sister, and she herself married both of her brothers at different times, although no children were produced in those marriages. This was often done in order to preserve pure bloodlines. It was believed that Isis, who we've mentioned before, and Osiris were brother and sister, who married each other to maintain the power of their family. If you look at the lineages of pharaohs, you will see marriages between brothers and sisters, even between parents and children in history. Of course, as we know today, this typically causes offspring to have severe disabilities. King Tut, for instance, had a congenital disability in his legs, causing mobility problems, and speech disorders due to a cleft palate. Other pharaohs were found to have other malformations, such as Froelich syndrome, which is caused by extensive inbreeding within royal families. This tradition continued until the very last native Egyptian pharaohs reigned. Number 24. Sometimes required servants to be covered in honey. Pepi II, who we've also already talked about, was known as a particularly demanding ruler. Perhaps it was due to the fact that he became a pharaoh so early on in life, but whatever the reason, he obviously felt extra privilege, maybe even more than other pharaohs, because he really hated flies, and he demanded that his servants be covered in honey to attract the insects away from him. He was also known for other ludicrous behaviors, such as asking Harkuf, a governor of Aswan and the head of one of the expeditions Pepi II sent to Nubia, to politely capture a pygmy, someone of particularly short stature, to be brought back to dance for him in his court. Further, Pepi II's disdain for flies did not reflect the attitudes of other Egyptians towards the insects. Instead, due to their swiftness and unwavering persistence, the fly was held in high esteem by some. Golden flies would even be awarded to soldiers who displayed heroic qualities on the battlefield. Number 25. Wrapped their dead in a mile of bandages. Let's start this one with a fun fact. It was South Americans who were attributed with inventing the mummification process, not the ancient Egyptians. It's believed that the South Americans, specifically in Peru, had been doing it for 2,000 years prior to the first person being mummified in Egypt. In any event, Egyptians mummify the dead to keep the body intact so that it could be transported to the spiritual afterlife. The process as a whole was pretty intricate, and each step needed to be precise in order to be done properly, and one of them had to do with wrapping the body in cloth that was over a mile long. It should be noted that not everyone in ancient Egypt was afforded the courtesy of becoming a mummy and living on in the afterlife. Instead, it was reserved for the wealthier members of society. Once properly dried and wrapped, the body would be put inside of a sarcophagus, which was made of stone. It was often carved or painted. Then, after special objects like the jars, figurines, and mummified animals that we already mentioned were also put inside, and the whole thing would be buried in a tomb.